January 3, 2026. Caracas, Venezuela. U.S. President Donald Trump announced in an official statement from Washington that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro had been captured by U.S. forces. The announcement was brief. No details on where the operation occurred, which units were involved, or Maduro's current status. But the language used made clear this wasn't a momentary claim. It was part of an active, ongoing process in the field. Such announcements aren't made carelessly. Declaring a head of state's capture isn't just a military move. It's a step directly affecting international law, diplomacy, and global security balances. The timing and tone matter as much as the content. Information was limited, but statements were clear. The process wasn't being hidden, just managed in a controlled way. Minutes later, international news agencies made it their headline. Global TV channels interrupted broadcasts. Additional statements from official institutions emphasized the operation was continuing and security priorities were, in effect, without going into detail. This showed what was happening wasn't a one-night operation, but part of a broader process unfolding in stages. In Caracas, at the same time, security mobilization was observed. Military checkpoints were established in certain areas of the capital. Security measures increased around strategic public buildings. Airspace restrictions were imposed. Flight plans changed. These developments showed control on the ground was continuing, and only the first phase was being reflected to the public. The limited information presented to the public wasn't a deficiency, but a conscious choice. In large-scale state operations, especially those directly affecting a country's governance, not all information is shared at once. Because in such situations, the real risk isn't the field developments themselves, but the political and security consequences of early, uncontrolled information flow. Therefore, statements were clear but measured. Details spread over time. The emerging picture was becoming clearer. The event had happened. The process was advancing. Security and political effects were being felt. But the narrative presented to the public reflected not everything happening, but the part that needed managing. This showed once again that in modern crises, power is established not only in the field, but in when, how, and to what extent information is shared. From this point forward, the issue wasn't whether what happened occurred. It was how this process would advance, what stages it would go through, and under what headlines it would be presented to the world. Because what was happening had now entered a process affecting not only Venezuela but global balances. So do you think a process conducted with such limited information inspires confidence or raises bigger questions? In your opinion, is this first announcement the beginning of stability or a herald of a more complex period? If you're curious about what's behind this process, what might happen next, and how such global crises are managed, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. What we're covering in this video isn't a standalone event. It's a file with continuation, advancing step by step. Also, check out other videos on the channel where we explain similar current crises affecting the world, state, operations, and historical turning points. If this content added value, liking the video really matters for continuing this series. The hours following the first official announcements clearly showed what was happening wasn't limited to a military operation. A much broader process had been set in motion. Venezuela's governing structure maintained public silence while behind the scenes, intense activity occurred at different layers of the state mechanism. This silence came not from uncertainty, but from awareness that the process needed controlled management. Security measures in the capital Caracas were gradually increased. Strategic public buildings, energy infrastructure, and communication centers were placed under military protection. Control areas were established at certain points in the city. civilian passage restricted in some zones. State television and official communication channels simplified their broadcasts. Regular programs replaced by carefully selected, limited briefings. The main purpose of these steps was preventing the perception of a power vacuum, because in such periods the biggest risk isn't the event itself but chaos created by uncontrolled information flow. A similar cautious stance was notable in the international arena. Many countries and international organizations made brief statements noting they were closely monitoring developments. Harsh reactions were specifically avoided. Diplomatic channels kept open. This approach showed the process wasn't yet complete, and every step needed careful calculation. Contacts behind closed doors were shaped through scenarios concerning not just Venezuela's situation, but regional and global balances. At this point, timing carried critical meaning. What was happening occurred on fragile ground created by economic pressure, political tension, and international sanctions Venezuela had been under for a long time. Declining energy revenues, disruptions in public services, and social tension were already straining the governing structure. Therefore, the operation was evaluated not as a singular development, but as an inevitable breaking point of problems accumulating over time. As field developments progressed, why information flow was being kept limited became clearer. In such a process, early or uncontrolled announcements could drag not only internal balances but international relations to a point of no return. Therefore, officials preferred giving the message that the process was under control rather than sharing images and details. A period had begun where every piece of information shown was chosen more carefully than what wasn't shown. The world was now watching what was happening not as an ending, but as the beginning of a much more complex, long-term process. Because a head of state's capture doesn't mean events have ended. It means the door has opened to a new era where legal processes, diplomatic negotiations, and internal political balances will be reshaped. And at this very point, we must stop and ask, do you think such controlled silence was necessary to preserve stability, or are certain truths being deliberately hidden from the public? Will the steps taken in this process carry Venezuela toward a more secure future, or drag it into deeper uncertainty? As the process advanced, it became clearer that what was happening wasn't just a power shift within Venezuela. This development was also a breaking point directly affecting regional balances and global interests. Because Venezuela had long been at the center of international struggle, not only with its political position, but with its energy resources and geopolitical location. Therefore, every step taken in the country resonated far beyond its borders. Increased security measures for energy infrastructure following the operation were notable. Military presence was intensified around ports, refinery areas, and oil fields. These steps showed the process wasn't limited to management cadres. The state's strategic arteries were simultaneously being brought under control. Uninterrupted energy flow, preventing economic collapse risk, and continuity of public services had become the most critical topics at this stage. International markets didn't remain indifferent to developments. Fluctuations in oil and energy prices clearly showed investors were closely following the process. These reactions reminded once again that developments in Venezuela could have not only regional but global economic consequences, because every shock in this country reflected directly or indirectly on worldwide energy balances. On the diplomatic front, intense traffic began. Meetings behind closed doors were shaped through different scenarios about how the process would be managed. Some countries emphasized stability and order. Others drew attention to the legal dimension of the process. But the common point was clear. No one wanted to risk the consequences an uncontrolled break would create. Therefore, statements were measured, rhetoric careful, and steps cautious. Within Venezuela, public opinion's pulse was being monitored sensitively. While security measures continued, daily life wasn't allowed to completely stop. Markets, transportation lines, and basic services maintained function. This approach aimed to preserve the perception of normalization and prevent social tension from rising. Because in such periods, even the smallest spark can turn into large-scale instability quickly. At this stage, the process began being evaluated more through management skill than military success. Controlled areas, regulated information flow, and messages given offered strong clues about how the next step would be shaped. Every decision was being made not only to manage the current picture, but to make emerging new balances permanent. The simultaneous progress of security, economy, and diplomacy topics showed the process was being handled with a long-term restructuring goal, not as temporary. The issue was no longer just a leader's capture. The real topic was how the order established afterward would be shaped, which actors would come to the forefront, and how this change would affect the country's future. This revealed what was happening wasn't an ordinary crisis in Venezuela's history, but a real turning point that would determine the country's direction. And precisely for this reason, eyes had turned from military developments in the field to political and diplomatic decisions to be made. Because this process's course had the power to determine not only today, but Venezuela's and the region's coming years. So what do you think is the real determinant in this process? Control of energy resources, diplomatic negotiations, or the military balance established in the field? Will this restructuring carry Venezuela to a stronger position, or is it preparing the ground for new conflicts? As the process deepened, it became increasingly clear that what was happening wouldn't remain limited to just security and governance dimensions. Topics coming to the agenda at this stage were now going beyond military operations, bringing with them a search for new balance with their legal, political, and international consequences. A head of state's capture wasn't a result by itself. It was the starting point of successive decisions to come. At this point, legal processes began coming to the forefront. Issues like international law, sovereignty debates, and jurisdiction became central to diplomatic contacts. Which court would have jurisdiction, what charges would be officially directed, and how the process would be conducted concerned not only Venezuela, but all actors directly or indirectly involved. Therefore, every decision to be made was being carefully considered not only in terms of domestic law, but also global balances. Diplomatic channels intensified even more at this stage. Meetings behind closed doors were shaped around topics that didn't reflect to the public, but determined the process's direction. While some countries advocated the process should quickly reach stability, others emphasized that the legal process needed meticulous operation. The common concern, however, was clear. An uncontrolled development could lead to long-term instability, not only in Venezuela, but throughout the region. Within Venezuela, a new balance was being tried to establish. Steps were being taken to ensure state institutions' functioning continued, public services weren't disrupted, and no security vacuum was created. Messages given in this process were clear. The governing mechanism is working, control is being provided, and the transition process is being managed. This approach aimed to prevent a sudden break or panic in society. In international public opinion, perception management gained separate importance. How the process was narrated, which topics were highlighted, and which details were left in the background directly affected the event's global resonance. Therefore, statements made were used not only to inform, but also to frame the process's direction. In modern crises, narrative control had become as determinant as field developments. There was now a reality everyone was aware of. This process couldn't be handled as a short-term development. Decisions to be made, steps to be taken, and new balances to be established were of a nature to shape Venezuela's coming years. This turned what was happening from a temporary crisis into a turning point that would leave permanent effects on the country's political and administrative structure. At this stage, the question was no longer what happened, but it turned into what will happen next, because the process had long passed a reversible point, and what came after was building a new reality with every step taken. This reality was opening the door to a process that would determine not only today's, but future years' political framework. So what do you think will be the real determinant from this point on? Legal decisions, diplomatic negotiations, or the new power balance established in the field? Will this process bring permanent stability for Venezuela, or will it be the beginning of new long-term tensions? Having reached this point, there was now a very clear reality. What was happening wasn't a temporary news wave or a crisis to be talked about and forgotten in a few days. This process was part of a major break advancing step by step, whose effects spread over time. The time passed since the first announcement clearly showed the event was being handled not only as a military or political move, but as a development reshaping global balances. While control was being established in the field, new calculations were being made behind the scenes. How legal processes would work, in which direction diplomatic relations would progress, and how Venezuela's internal balances would be re-established were no longer possibilities. They were actively planned topics. In such processes, uncertainty doesn't completely disappear, but direction becomes clear. And in this event, the direction was advancing toward a point that would affect not only Venezuela's future, but regional and global relations. Information reflected to the public was still limited. But this limitation wasn't a weakness, it was an indicator of how tightly the process was being kept under control. In the modern world, power isn't established only through field moves. When, how, much, and how information is shared is as determinate as military steps. That's why every silence carried meaning as much as every announcement. Details hidden as much as shown were part of this process. The world wasn't only watching these developments. It was also interpreting, discussing, and making sense of them according to its own perspective. Social media, news channels, and commentary platforms were producing multiple perceptions at once instead of a single truth. This situation was amplifying the event's impact even more, because now the issue had become not just what happened, but how it was narrated and in what framework it was placed. In coming days, new announcements will be made. New steps will be taken. Legal processes will become more visible. Diplomatic moves will be clearly felt. But whatever details are disclosed, this event has already gone down in history, because developments simultaneously affecting a country's governance, regional balances, and global perception always leave permanent traces. What's happening today will be at the center of analyses and documentaries to be written in the future. And perhaps the most critical point is exactly this. Such processes aren't shaped only by decisions states make. Public reaction, society's perspectives, and how people interpret these events also affect the process's direction. Comments made today can form the ground for steps taken tomorrow. Silence is also a reaction, so is speaking. Both are part of this story. Now let's stop and think. Do you think this process is being managed correctly? Will the steps taken really bring stability, or will they open the door to bigger crises? Is this development a new beginning for Venezuela, or the first link in long-lasting uncertainty? These questions have no clear answer, but your answer matters. Be sure to share your opinion in the comments. Write how you read this process, which step you think will be determinant. Because such historical moments gain meaning not only because they're experienced, but by how they're interpreted. If you don't want to miss content that explains current events not superficially, but in depth and from behind the scenes, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. This file isn't closing here. As new developments occur, we'll meet again in the next chapter of this unfolding process.